Testing. All right. Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. I hope everyone here is doing well today and excited for today's discussion. My name is Mandy, and I will be your master of ceremony for today. It is with great pleasure to present His Excellency Dennis Chaibi, Ambassador of the European Union to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam, for the first 2025 EU Ambassador Lecture. Welcome, Ambassador Dennis. How are you today? Okay. This year, the year 2024 marks a pivotal moment for both Indonesia and the European Union, as both have undergone significant political transitions following their respective elections. With new leaders ready at the helm, the trajectory of Indonesia-EU relations will be formed by new policy directions, emerging opportunities, and evolving geopolitical changes forward on. In this EU Ambassador Lecture, His Excellency Dennis Chaibi will dive into the new dynamics of Indonesia-EU relations and discuss pathways for deeper collaboration in this evolving global landscape. Today's lecture will be moderated by FPCI's Calvin Ko, the Director of FPCI Research and Analysis. Welcome, Ka Calvin. Next, we would also like to welcome all of the students who are gathered here today from the FPCI University chapter in the Jakarta area. We would also like to acknowledge our online participants who are tuning in our YouTube channel. But before we begin, please don't forget to share your moments with us here at the EU Ambassador Lecture by tagging at FPCI Indo and Uni Eropa on your social media posts. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now begin today's discussion. Please give a warm welcome to our moderator for today, Kak Calvin. You may have the floor.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. Friends, I want to ask an audience check, Ambassadors. Let's do an audience check because I've been doing a survey in the past 5 years, so this is my habit, always checking the audience. Okay, please raise hand who think Europe is the champion of climate change. Those who agree, please raise your hand. On climate change. Anyone knows? Okay, all right. Who's here knows that Indonesian currently the DPR is even drafting the law on AI and technologies. Is actually inspired from EU law on the related issue. Those who knows this, please raise your hand. Okay, all right. No, not much knows about these informations. Okay, the last questions. Who's here's? Which are you agree with me? Today we see the decline of rules-based international orders. Those who are believe with me or agree with me, please raise your hand. Okay, all right. And then, do you agree with me that multilateralism is one of the is still the best, most sufficient, not sufficient. Do you agree with me that multilateralism has still becoming a good public goods for international relations? Those who agree with me, please raise your hand. All right, so we got a lot of multilateralists, Ambassador. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the microphone to Ambassador Dennis to give your sharing, your view about Indonesia-EU, the bilateral relationship, but also about the world, how the EU sees the world, about the current trends, and after that we'll continue with discussions. Ambassadors also will talk about the trade, etc. And I would like to encourage you to ask questions as much as you can, right? And I believe this would bring a great value to you. So without further ado, ambassadors, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm Denis Shaibi. I've been here for a bit more than a year, almost a year and a half. I have had 30 years in the European Union, and before that I was a Belgian diplomat. So I have some experience to share, but I'm going to speak fast. So we're going to go through the slides quickly. So think hard about the questions you will want to ask, because I want to move quickly through the material so that we can have good Q&A. So there are, in the title, 3 parts: new leaders, new challenges, new opportunities. Basically, it's going to be a lot about new opportunities. Leaders and challenges is just to introduce the discussion. So it will be mainly about the opportunities in EU-Indonesia relations. So let's start with the new leaders. So the first thing that strikes perhaps is the fact that among the 4 top people who are very active in representing the EU in the world, we have 3 women. It is something fundamental in the EU. We believe in gender, in using the entire society, in not playing with half of the deck of cards, but with all the cards. So in this case, the result of the different voting procedure, because all these people have been selected either by the leaders or by the European Parliament, by the people. So all these people come through a very democratic selection, the elections or parliament. And so the 3 women and that man are our leaders. So we have Ursula von der Leyen. She's the former Minister of Defense of Germany. It's her 2nd time as President of the Commission. She's German, and she has a long experience. She's also a doctor in medicine, which was very useful during COVID crisis. And she's the mother of 7 children. So, so she has done it all. And she has lived in different parts of the world. She lived in the United States, now in Belgium and in Germany. So she's a very cosmopolitan person. Then Antonio Costa, if you see him, and I'm going to make bad jokes, he is almost as tan as the President of the United States, but it's because of his ethnic origin rather than a bronze lamp. He has parents who come from India. So his grandparents were from India. And therefore you can see that he relates much more to countries like India, Indonesia, because his grandparents come from India. So he's very interested in coming to Indonesia. We're trying to find a good date. He has been the Prime Minister of Portugal. Portugal is a country that is not one of the biggest in Europe. It's next to Spain in the Iberian Peninsula. But it's a country that has been really projecting itself onto the world for the last 600 years. And they were the first one to come to Indonesia from Europe. I am aware that they didn't leave only good memories, but they are now very keen to undertake a different form of cooperation. Roberta Metsola, the name is not betraying her origin. She's from Malta, and Malta is one of the smallest countries in the EU, with the smallest capital in the EU, Valletta. And so it shows that the person that is the head of our European Parliament comes from the smallest capital city. What does it tell you? It tells you that it's a very democratic process. If the person who has the least people voting for her in the European Parliament from her country she's chosen. So it's a very, very democratic and very transparent process. It's also a 2nd term as President of the Parliament. So she's been re-elected because people believe that the results of the first time were good. And finally, Kaja Kallas. She's from Estonia. Again, a very small country. So, you know, it's very important to see that the political representation is not only from the largest country, Germany, that's the President of the Commission, But you know, you see the other big countries, France, Poland, Spain, are not among the leaders. So it shows that the leaders are very democratic and establish a good balance in Europe. And so Kaja Kallas was the prime minister, so she was a prime minister, the head of a country, and still was interested in becoming the high representative, so the equivalent of Minister of Foreign Affairs. So we move to what those four leaders incarnate. So I think it's very, very important to realize how economically important the EU is, because everyone talks about China, India, obviously the US and all that. So few numbers. GDP nominal, and you can talk about purchasing power parity, and I will explain that concept, but nominal, which is the assets that you have every year creating. The US is 27 trillion. 27 trillion. So the next in lines are China and EU basically equal. 18 trillion. So the US is vastly richer than China and EU, and they have less people. So you have to realize how rich the US is, but then you have to realize that EU is as rich as China, with a third of the people. With a third of the people of China, we are as rich as China. We can purchase product, we can create wealth as much as China. And then if you look at the other countries that you know, Japan is less than a fourth of China or less than a fourth of EU. Less than a fourth. India is less than a fourth. And then when you move to UK and things. So it's very important to understand the magnitude of the wealth of the country, because Indonesia wants to sell products to the world. And it's very important to know to which country you are able to sell the products. Indonesia is doing well. It has 1.5 trillion, so it's the 15 in the world. But obviously, in terms of your purchasing power, you're much higher. You're the 8th in the world. And when you have a strong economic growth, your purchasing power parity will rejoin the nominal. So Indonesia, in this kind of league of rich nations, you know, there are 193 countries in the United Nations and more than 200 overall. So Indonesia is the 15th, and it's on the trajectory to easily become the 8th. So we are bound to be markets doing more and more together if we want to stay at this level of wealth. I mean, for us to stay and for you to grow. The EU is the largest trading bloc. So they said second after China. That's if you just look at goods. But if you add services, we are the largest. And we are the largest exporters of trade in services. Much more than, for example, China, which has only 290 billion of services. We are also one of the biggest investors. So we invest a lot outside, and it's normal. Our populations are shrinking, not booming. We don't have much resources. Indonesia has lots of natural resources. In EU, we don't have much natural resources. So for us, it's very important to be able to invest and trade. That's the source of our growth. So because we have such an interest in investing and in trading, we need order, we need rules. You know, if there are no rules, that means that every time we ship or we order, something can be seized in the sea by pirates or by countries that live along. So we need rules, we need order. That's fundamental to our economic model, because we need the rest of the world to keep the same level of wealth. So if we come to the challenges, we feel that the world in which Europe didn't do too badly, because after the Second World War, we were really on the floor. People were starving. We had no more infrastructure. And so over the last 80 years, we have made some good progress thanks to multilateralism and rules-based order. The guarantor of this was the United States. The United States feel now, with the new president, that this rules-based order is not as interesting for them as the US exercising its power directly on each actor. This is the choice of the US. For the EU, this is a difficult situation because the US guaranteed the security of the sea lanes, of the trade, of the rules. The second problem is climate change. Climate change in Europe is a big problem because we are congested. We have a high density per square kilometer, not as big as Java. Java is one of the biggest density in the world. We have 1,000 per square kilometers. We have less than half of that, but it's still quite compact, and we don't have the 17 other islands where we can go. So climate change makes us very vulnerable. So there's less trade openness. The EU worked a lot to build an international regime of trade, the WTO, and all the rules of those trading regimes are being eroded one by one, and this makes it very difficult to continue economic growth to trade. And then now the newest challenge is the fact that artificial intelligence development and everything that is digital is really concentrating in US, China, a bit Japan, a bit less Europe. And we can see that there will be a monopoly of all the productivity that comes from artificial intelligence, and that would be very unfair for the world. So we are very concerned by that. So these are the key challenges. When you see what the EU is, what are the key challenges, what are the opportunities for EU-Indonesia? Well, it is exactly the opportunities that are created by the challenges. The challenges that we have are common. They are the same for Indonesia and for the EU. And so if we cooperate more, we can address those challenges together and with other partners. It's obviously not exclusive. So let me start with trade. You have a few keywords: growing, rewarding. I'm going to go through them and try to explain how we can trade more with each other. So first of all, the EU-Indonesia trade is growing. It didn't grow between 22 and 23, but if you look at the 10 years trend, you will see that it's growing consistently. So now we are at 30 billion, and we are a very important trading partner for Indonesia. We are the 5th one. What are the other major partners of Indonesia? So you have China. China is your biggest trade partner. But in terms of trade balance, is not the best one because you have a deficit of 10 billion with China. You have a much better result with the US, your second trade partner, or third, because you have a 14.3 surplus. Actually, the surplus was higher in 23. The problem with the surplus is that President Trump is very interested in putting tariffs on everyone who has a trade surplus with the US. So the trade surplus perhaps is not the most secure. And then you have a lot of surplus with India. It's not on the table, but it's a trade surplus based on coal exports. And Indonesia is the 11th reserves of coal, but it's the 4th producer and the 2nd exporter, which means that in basically 10 to 15 years, there will not be much coal left in Indonesia. So the trade surplus with India is also at risk. Perhaps there will be other things, and Indonesia is doing really well on palm oil. But what is clear is that for the products of the future, the EU is a more reliable market than US or India. And China, your biggest trade partner, is exporting more to you than you are exporting to them. So if you look at how to move forward in terms of trade, the basic thing is that diversification. For Indonesia, diversification is essential. It is already at stake with the ASEAN, and the EU thinks that it's very good for ASEAN partners to trade more with each other. We are very keen for us to encourage this, because then we can have a bigger basket of countries that have the same tariffs line. So for us, it's very important and very good. And we want to trade with Indonesia, because Indonesia has a large market. You're the fourth most populous nation in the world. So for any companies that trade with you, this is very, very attractive. It's doing well financially. The economic growth has been 5% every year. So you have a very, very attractive market in terms of absolute numbers. We have done a free trade agreement with Singapore and Vietnam, among your neighbors. And we have started, and it's going very fast, with Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand. So with Vietnam, the story is that the exports of Vietnam to the EU increased by almost 40% compared to 2020. So in 3 years, it increased by almost 40%. But what is not known is that Vietnam adapted its industry to the EU standards. In order to export to the EU, you adapt the EU standards for some products. And then basically your products become the most competitive in the world, because the standards of the EU are quite high. So when Vietnam adapted its standards, they increased by 40% their exports to the EU and their surplus. But the fantastic story for them is that they exploded their trade with the US, because the products were very good standards. They exploded, and now they are above 100 billion. Above 100 billion trade surplus with the US. I think they're gonna have interesting conversations with President Trump, but this is the ransom of success. So we want to do the same things as we did with Vietnam. We want to do the same with Indonesia. Have a free trade agreement that boosts our bilateral trade. But it's not only trade that we want. What we are really grateful to Indonesia is for its approach to multilateralism. Indonesia is a very strong voice within the United Nations system. In the Human Rights Council, Indonesia was voted with the highest number of votes ever for a country to be voted in the Human Rights Council. It is a society that practices tolerance, pluralism, non-discrimination, solidarity. These are all the values that Europe is built on. And that's why we have the same motto in Europe, is unity in diversity, like here. So it's because we are multiple societies. You have 17,000 islands, we have 27 countries, but at the end, we have even more populations. Even, in Spain, you have the Andalusians, or the Cantabricans, or the Catalans. In French, you have the Bretons. So we have, if you want, also thousands of mini islands within our countries. So that's why we practice the value of tolerance, because we live together. So that's the first big opportunity. The second big opportunity, green transition. We've talked about climate change. Climate change is a serious threat for the EU and a serious threat for Indonesia. Climate change is caused by the emissions of carbon and the lack of absorption of it. So, because Indonesia has the third or fourth most important ecosystem in the world, so basically your forests, you have, the Amazon in Brazil, you have Congo, and you have Indonesia. These are the three biggest environmental ecosystem based on forest. And it's not only that forests absorb a lot of carbon, this is very important obviously, but it's also that forests have or generate a lot of biodiversity. It's when it's not exploited, you have a lot of different organisms that thrive in a forest. And the more diverse organism we have, the better our crops or health will be. If there's no diversity, we're going to be very, very sensitive to any pest, to any bacteria, to any virus, because our system don't have a lot of different weapons to fight this. So biodiversity is essential for a common future. So in order to work with Indonesia on Indonesian territory, but that is fundamental for the rest of the world, the members of the G20, so the most important 20 nations in the world, agreed in the G20 summit in Bali in 2022 to have a partnership called Just Energy Transition. Basically, it's about now Germany, Japan, EU, France, Italy, UK, Norway, Canada, who commit to invest in the energy sector of Indonesia. And the idea is to reduce emission, phase out coal power plant, and help with infrastructure, such as cable of electricity transmission. It's not a great success so far in terms of disbursing money. The money disbursed, the EU has disbursed some money, and I will show it, but there are far more commitments than disbursements. So we need to work on that. The issue is that Indonesia makes it very clear now that it wants to use more coal than what was anticipated for its economic growth, and therefore the targets are changing, and because the targets are changing, the disbursements are changing. But still, Indonesia being a large market, there are lots of investors who are very keen to invest in energy in Indonesia. Another opportunity where we can work together is artificial intelligence. Let me tell you a story, and then I can illustrate this with the example. In China, the EU ambassador to China met a Chinese who is very active in artificial intelligence. And if you follow the news, you've seen that China has now managed to put an intelligence model that is almost as good as ChatGPT, but it uses only 6% of the energy that the ChatGPT model uses. You have to be aware that every time you use ChatGPT, you use a lot of energy, not so much by typing your question, but ChatGPT non-stop works to train the models. And when they train the model, so when the information is going through the servers to compare with, so they compare information with other pieces of information, it uses a lot of energy, So basically, the Chinese entrepreneur who worked on artificial intelligence thought, okay, what would be a very good market to expand artificial intelligence? And the Chinese thought, Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the best markets to expand artificial intelligence. So what I need to do now is to train a model that is like ChatGPT, but for the country where there's the largest Muslim population in the world. So a ChatGPT that is conceived for people who follow Muslim religion. So the Chinese are thinking of that. But you know, the Chinese are not treating all the Muslims in a very nice manner in China. You may know about this. And if you type in a Chinese bot, what happens to Taiwan, or what's happening in Uyghur, with the Uyghur, there will be no answers. If you type Tibet, there will be no answers. So what does it tell us? It tells us that in the EU, we have thought a lot about artificial intelligence, and we have come with regulation. People will say, yeah, the EU, they can only regulate, they cannot generate wealth. But what we are doing in Europe, we are protecting the health and safety and the fundamental rights. We want to promote innovation, but not innovation that is risky. So what we have done is we have classified artificial intelligence. For example, what is unacceptable risk, where people are using artificial intelligence to pitch group of people against each other. So this is not permitted. Hate speech that is generated by artificial intelligence, fake videos that shows, you know, perhaps a killing of one group by another, and it's fake and it's just to instill hate. So this is prohibited, and we have a legal basis to prohibit it, because in many countries there are no legal basis. So the image come on your Instagram, you don't know that it's artificial intelligence, and the person will not have to go to jail because there's no legal basis against it. We have a legal basis. and we classify. So high risk, for example, for recruitment or medical. You know, now you have interconnected medical device and the artificial intelligence relay your data to the producer so that, and then your data go into a database on how to best deal with that illness. Okay, the purpose is good, but if your employer know that you have that illness, then they will say, oh no, we don't want to recruit you. Or no, we have to fire you. So then artificial intelligence becomes a weapon against you. So in the EU, if you use artificial intelligence for this kind of things, it has to be confidential. So we've put a rule. So then there are some things like impersonation, chatbots. We need to have transparency on who is behind it. If someone answers questions and things, we need to know who is behind. And where there's no risk, then it's permitted according to the legislation. So it's just an example where we are experimenting a lot of things in Europe that can benefit also Indonesia, and we want to learn from Indonesia. If you get this artificial intelligence from China that is for a Muslim population geared, we have a lot of Muslim population in the EU, so we want to learn from Indonesia. So this is a place where we can both address this challenge. And what is important is, because we are 27 and we are enabling rules together, we are much more stable than other big countries. Why? As you saw from our leaders come from small countries, they are women, they go through an intense election, but where parliament is things, is not popular vote direct. So we have a lot of mechanism to prevent extremes from coming. It's not that we can say that there will never be extremes, but since we do everything at 27, we are far more stable and reliable. So this is what I wanted to do. Those is more for the Q&A, so I'm not going to go into that now. But I really wanted to make the case for closer relations between EU and Indonesia, and now I'm welcoming any question you would have.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very, very comprehensive, and I think you touch topics that rarely discussed in the discourse. I'll use this opportunity to ask the first questions, and I'm trying to place myself back in 15 years ago when I was in the college as an international relations student at UPH. I see one UPH persons there. All of us here are international relations, correct? Right. And remember, in the first semester, the study that we have is Intro to IR. Am I correct? Intro to IR. And in Intro in IR, the first slide of my professor was about the actor in international relations. Right? There is a state actor, non-state actors. However, I'm always undermine the slide talking about values, norms, and rules, because I took it for granted at that time. I took it for granted, and I need more than, to be honest, I've been in the industry, I mean in international relations for a very small year, for 10 years. I need 10 years to understand why rules is important. Ambassador, please enlighten us. You already touched a bit. Why norms like rules-based international order? How many times you heard your docent talk about rules-based international order? Many times, right? Did you got it, what that mean, actually, rules-based international order? Yeah. And there's also the slide when I was in school talking about country move based on interest. Right? Am I correct? Based on interest, national interest. And there's a question, how we can find the balance between being being an idealist, right? And also being pragmatic. President Prabowo wants 8% growth. Needs a lot of money coming in, right? But how we deal with the countries that trying to, discreetly push us to acknowledge disputes, for instance, and then we sign to that agreement, and then there's a norms issues. I think we know what we are talking about with. Ambassadors, simply to put to the students, what is rules rules-based international order, why is that matter in the daily basis of people's lives, and how we can find the balance between being an idealist and pragmatic in the same way better?
Thank you. So there are two questions, huh? The rules-based and then transactions. So on the first one, a question: when do the state, the concept of state, when did it started to exist in its modern manner? Very good, very good. Westphalian Treaty, 1648. So 1648, Westphalian. So people had been at war for basically 100 years. It was a succession between Spain, Netherlands, and France and UK and Germany were all playing. And so I'm very impressed that that you know all that. But then, you know, it's a concept. It's a concept. It's like a border. A border, unless you have for Indonesia it's different. You are islands. But unless you have a river or you're an island, most of the time a border is an imaginary line in a field. And in Europe it's very much that. You know, Europe, seen from here, is just a small peninsula at the end of Asia. But seen from Europe, it's a compact mass of people who speak different languages, different cultures, and then the only thing that separates them officially is a line in the middle of a field. And with the EU, that line has disappeared, and people resent that now. They're like, yeah, but this line protects us. So we have to combine the protection with... Why am I saying all that? Because if you don't have the creation of the state, what do you have? You have empires. If you don't have states, before the states, you have empires. And empires can be religious empire. So in Europe, people were using religions to say, we are a religious empire, and because I defend this religion, I invade you, I take your resources, I take your women, I take your markets, and everything is for my warriors. And my warriors can do everything as long as they put my flag, and I'm an empire. So we created states. And states are an instrument of self-respect. Sovereignty is an instrument of self-respect. So if we don't defend the states, we're going to go back to empires. And so the countries that are the largest and the most powerful will basically impose their will to the countries that are not as rich or as powerful. This is what we are talking about. And how does a state encourage the rest of the states to guarantee this balance? It's by being democratic. If you have democracy within your state, you have the legitimacy to say to the other states, let's unite and not allow for the return of the empire. If you're not democratic, it's much harder to say, oh, you don't have the right to come and oppress my people, because people will say, yeah, but you're not democratic, so I'm coming to free your people. There's a battle of narrative that is very important. And when the country is very democratic inside, it can resist the definition of empires. And I think that's why Indonesia is such an important country in this region. You are the most robust and the deepest democracy in Southeast Asia. And some other countries may be offended if I say that, so don't repeat it. But the Reformasi movement has produced the deepest and strongest democracy in Indonesia. So you have the legitimacy in the whole ASEAN to discuss this new narrative that now, you know, if big countries start to meet together without those who live there and decide the fate of the people who live there. You know, you follow Gaza. Are the Palestinians included in any talks? You follow Ukraine. Are the Ukrainian... This is an imperial approach. And it's very important to not follow an imperial approach. So that's for rules-based order, countries and things. Now, transactions and values. So we were at the ambassadors conference, and we heard a lot in the speeches. We have to be more transactional in this very difficult world. But you know, we as diplomats, we come with a certain perception. You perceive the EU with certain things. It can be over-regulatory, or some of our Indonesian partners say that we are neo-colonialist. So we have positive perception and bad perception. But these perceptions are basically the values that are incarnated by the EU. But then what we try to do is to find an area where all partners will win something and we will win something. Like, for example, more trade. So what I'm trying to say is that transaction, which is a win-win situation, is not against values. Values is what we incarnate. It is the basis of our approach. And on that basis, we propose a transaction, a win-win solution. And that's what we want to do.
Very good 2 points from Ambassador. Now, I would like to open the floor. Anyone to ask the questions? I would like to open the first 3. You, and then the number 2 and number 3. Okay, start with you and then follow with Binus and also dari UPN ya, veteran ya. Okay, please.
Well, thank you for the opportunities. Let me introduce myself a little bit. My name is Christina, and I am from Binus University. I only want to ask about simple questions about human resources. Well, according to some sources, and like as you said before, European countries, some of European countries, the human resources in the European Union countries are decreasing. So I would like to ask, do you think, are there any possibilities for Indonesian workers could have a job in some of European countries? Why I would like to ask this question? Well, because I am really interested to study and work in European countries. Well, that's all. Thank you very much.
You don't have any correlation with kabur aja dulu, right?
No, no.
Just want to make sure, you know.
Actually, that's my dream. Yeah, but just keep it out for us. Okay, thank you.
All right, please from veteran. Yeah. Veteran ya di belakang. Yeah.
No, Win.
Oh, bukan, Win. Okay, please do.
Okay, thank you for opportunity today. And the European Union Deforestation Regulation (EUDR) face challenge despite if the commitment to multilaterally define objective of reducing deforestation and forest degradation. Several countries and forests the regulation called potential and exclude small players. And I want to ask about how do you access the current state of EUDR implementation, and what steps should the Union take to ensure the effectiveness while supporting the prosperity of small holders? Thank you.
Right, and then the last questions. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Mr. Kaibi. And I want to ask you about European Green Deal. As you mentioned before, that EU has European Green Deal and CBAM, which has high standards to fulfill. And as you mentioned before, Vietnam could fulfill that standards. And I've learned about this in my class. About Indonesia's struggles to fulfill the EU Green Deal and CBAM standards due to strict rules and sustainability conflicts with its economic needs. The EU impose products like palm oil, but also enforces tough regulations to Indonesia, making it difficult and hard for Indonesia to compete. With the financial or technological help, Indonesia is stuck between growing its economic and meeting Green Deal standards. So my question is, how can Europe Union and Indonesia solve this problem? How can Indonesia remain to compete under these rules? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Okay. So, thank you for these three very good questions. So education in the EU, also human resources. So yes, we have a shrinking birth rate, not in every member state, but in most. The only way that we are maintaining our level is immigration. We have obviously lots of net migration. It is a positive thing in economic terms for the EU, but it makes politics very complicated. It leads to radicalization for different reasons. It's not just Europe. In Japan, in China, the situation is even worse than Europe. And both China and Japan are not relying on migration. Same for South Korea. South Korea is the worst of the denatality case in the world. So it's not uncommon. Migration happens in Europe, and even before the elections in the US, there were more legal migrants in the EU every year than in the US. US is officially a migrant country and EU officially not, but we have something called family reunification. So every brother or sister can join the existing member in Europe, and this has led to a lot of migration, and it is also a sort of loophole that now some politicians want to discuss. Anyway, studying in Europe is the best. Studying in Europe is the best. Why? First of all, and it's the most important thing, it will cost far less than US, Australia, or UK. So we start with that. It's far less. But the quality is equal because we have invested over the last 800 years in our universities. We have an entire ecosystem of professors, researchers. So the big difference is we have a lot of research programs that are connected to companies. And this is something Indonesia has to absolutely do, connect the universities to companies and become more research oriented. We do it in Europe. But the best of all is, at the moment, 1 out of 4 students gets a grant. 1 out of 4 students. We have 4,000 students from Indonesia going every year to Europe, and 1,000 get a grant in some form. So 300 get it from Erasmus, and then a lot get it from Germany. Now, and Germany is the country where most Indonesian students go. It's the most popular. Now, I think that the Germans gonna perhaps have a second look at their grants, so perhaps it will not be as generous as before, but they have also sponsors or loans. What is important is what we want to make sure is that we speed up the visa delivery, because I know that the visa is often a problem and that students do all the file and then at the end it takes a long time to get the visa and they go for another things. So this is where we want to work. But we do every year a big European fair with more than 100 universities from Europe. It's generally in October. So this is a place where I encourage you to come for master's degree. And then we have also the Erasmus that you can easily find on internet and apply to, which is also a very good scholarship. But, and let me finish with that, is if you study in Europe, you can do the Erasmus program, not only the grant, but so you can do, let's say you're accepted in Spain, and then you can do 6 months in Italy or in France. And you know, Europeans themselves, they would love they would love to do 6 months in Spain and 6 months in Italy. So this is a possibility for you to do something. Okay, EUDR. So I kind of anticipated that question, so we go to my next slide. EU deforestation regulation, palm oil and anti-deforestation regulation. It is a very sensitive subject. Indonesia feels that the EU has overstretched its regulatory capacity, that it is targeting Indonesia because Indonesia is the largest palm oil producer. It feels that it is discriminatory. And yeah, it hits a nerve because the former colonial power used a lot of plantation concept in Indonesia, and because palm oil are plantations, we are in an area that is very sensitive. So let me address the criticism. First of all, saying that it's discriminatory. So the EU anti-deforestation regulation applies to everyone. And those who are really discussing it very hardly are the European states themselves. So this applies to the member states of Europe. So to say that it is discriminatory is not really appropriate, because it applies to everyone, including in the EU. It doesn't target Indonesia as the largest palm oil producer, because it includes rubber. So Thailand could say, oh, but it targets me because there's rubber. Or it includes cocoa, so the Ghana or Ivory Coast could say, oh, target. So all the countries that produce one commodity could feel targeted. But if they're all targeted, then they are no longer targeted. So it applies to the entire world and the EU. What is the aim? The aim is to send a strong signal that one can do export commodities and get the same amount of money by improving the way the commodities are cultivated. Before we cut forest to expand the culture of cocoa or rubber or palm oil, we have to think ourselves, is it possible to increase the yield, the productivity? And I really encourage you to read a bit on the internet, or even better, to speak to the specialists of palm oil in Indonesia. They will all tell you that there's ample room for maneuver to improve the productivity of palm oil. Lots of producers are producing 1 ton per hectare, but some others are producing 8 tons per hectare. So what we need to do is to see how we can improve and maximize the palm oil exports without endangering goods that are also very useful for the rest of the world. Now, the main criticism is that it really prevents the growth of Indonesia economy. So it says this, this EU regulation prevents the growth of Indonesia economy. So just figures. Indonesia produces about 20 million tons of palm oil every year. Out of this, 50% are exported. So 50% of the production is exported. Out of these 50%, only 5% of the production are exported to the EU. 5% of the production is exported to the EU. Of these 5% of palm oil that is exported to the EU, 3 to 4% comes from large plantations that are in direct contract with the biggest importers in Europe, which are Unilever, Ferrero Rocher, and these kind of companies who have certified and who would have certified their supply chain long time ago, not because of the regulation, just because they cannot afford to have a picture on Instagram that says Unilever has deforested Indonesia for your soap. If Unilever cannot answer that criticism, they will not sell any soap in Europe. So they would have certified anyway without regulation. So if you take all that, that means that 1% of the palm oil production of Indonesia is directly affected by the EU deforestation regulation. Perhaps indirectly, there's more, but directly, where we have figures, it's 1%. So to say that the EU is the worst evil because of the EU deforestation regulation for 1%, and which is a force for good, I have some difficulties. And you know, the EU deforestation regulation asks for two things: legality, so that the operators get a deed, that the operation is legal, and traceability, so that you have a phone with a satellite connection and you go around the mapping and you say this was not deforested since 2020. You know, for the producer, the smallholder, if they have a deed, then they can go to the bank because they have a guarantee and they can ask for a mortgage or a loan. So there are lots of positive things even for the smallholders, but it needs reform, it needs changes, it needs transparency. And this is, I understand, sometimes difficult. So what we are doing as Europe, we are funding pilot projects to help the smallholders, and the previous slide shows that we have almost 14 million euro of projects where we are helping things. So with 1 million euro, you can almost certify 30,000 smallholders. So the EU, and it's grants, it's not loans, it's grant. It's given by the EU taxpayer to the Indonesian. We have 14 million euro of projects. So we are really, really helping, and we hope that we can get a better conversation on this subject, because all the other countries in the world, they are engaging. And they are engaging, and because they are engaging, they may sell more palm oil to the EU. So it's very important for Indonesia to engage and implement rather than just criticize. Then the third question, the Green Deal and CBAM. CBAM, so very important things. CBAM, so CBAM is basically if a product such as steel or cement comes to the EU, it is supposed to have used X amount of carbon. So it's the emissions produced, so steel, cement are industrial products that produce a lot of emissions, lots of emissions. They are the biggest emitter in terms of industrial product. So there's a fixed amount of carbon that is assigned when the quantity comes, and the exporter, so the Indonesian exporter, has to show that it has either offset the emissions or used the process that didn't put the emissions. But the thing that is very important is that if Indonesia sets up a carbon market, if it sets up a carbon market, then the tax that is paid to the Indonesian authorities, not to the EU. So what the EU wants is that every country around the world that produce steel, cement, and these kind of things sets up a carbon market, puts a price on carbon so that the industry starts to rationalize their effort. But the EU is not asking for the money to be paid to the EU. The money can be paid to the local authorities, but for that you need to set up a carbon market. So the EU wants to make sure that there's a level playing field, and wants to, and hope that other states would also put a price on carbon so that the entire industrial complex can start working, paying more attention to the carbon emissions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Before I open the second round, I want to chip in with a comment. I'm here trying to be fair and also appreciate European mission. If we look our international relationship, Indonesia or ASEAN as we, and look with the dialogue partners of ASEAN or the big players of traditional partners of Indonesia, we have a lot of differences and conflicts. But with EU, our differences is actually about a agreement, and within the framework of agreement and a policy debates. With China, we have an issue on the South China Sea. Indonesia doesn't have any disputes, but we are, as an ASEAN, have that issues, right? With Australia, we have a problem with AUKUS, etc. Right? But EU, although it's not apple to apple, but the debate is always continuous and always has a progress, and the mechanism exists. So that's a good thing. The communication continues, the dialogue continues, and then the mechanism is provided, and it's a fair game, and it's fair play. Right? We learned the recent development that Indonesia prevailed in the WTO, but it doesn't stop the discussion of the differences and how we settle on together. So we need to see Indonesia-EU relationship manage to come up with the differences with the existing mechanism with the good faith to continue discussing. So you need to see not only on the strategic communication between the leaders, but also on the implementations of the policy. Both are working and running in the same speed, right? So that's a good thing about the relationship between the two. And I would like to appreciate to you ambassadors and your colleagues that you're always consistent in messaging and talking to your counterparts about the differences. Now I would like to open the second round. Anyone wants to ask? Yes? Wow, a lot. Okay. Okay, now I'll go two from Binus and two in the backs. Yeah, two in the backs. It's okay. Yang belakang dulu ya. Kalian berdua. Ya. Oh gini deh. Satu kamu, choose each one of you, and then one you di depan ya. So one from Binus and then two from veteran ya kan, UPN ya. Okay, and then Mas in batik. It's okay. I give it to you. Okay, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador, FPCA friends. My name is Kane from FPCA Chapter Binus, and my question is in regards towards trade and climate change. So when we talk about trade and climate change, I think the most prevalent matter is the electric vehicle market right now. And especially in Indonesia, the electric vehicle market has been quite mostly dominated by the Chinese automakers. Now, in order for the European, let's say European car brands to stay prevalent in Asia and in, let's say, Indonesia, what do you think the EU and perhaps its automobile industry should do to perhaps collaborate in order to perhaps stop let's say a Chinese EV market monopoly in Asia or in Indonesia? Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm Fifi from Venus University, and my question are actually pretty similar to the previous question. Regarding the market monopoly done by big trade powers like China, it is really interesting to me how this artificial intelligence development has become both a challenge and opportunity to EU and Indonesia. And so I want to ask how does EU would respond to this market monopoly on AI basis? Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends and Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for the opportunity. So, as you know, Indonesia have been exporting nickel for many years to European Union. But in 2020, our former President Jokowi stopped exporting nickels and bauxite as raw materials for batteries. The nickel ore export ban policy received strong protests from the European Union by suing Indonesia through the World Trade Organization in the early 2021. And I haven't heard any news about that issue since then. So my question is, how are the export-imports relationship between Indonesia and the European Union today? Thank you. Yeah, export-import relationships between Indonesia and the EU. And Yeah. Oh yeah. So in 2020, our former president Joko Widodo stopped exporting nickels to EU. Am I? Yeah, nickel ores. Yeah. Thank you. And that's my question. Thank you for the opportunities.
Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Mr. Ambassador, in recent days, there has been an issue in Indonesia. As we know, our government has issued a policy on the budget efficiency, which cuts budget's positive aspects such as education and health aspect. In Mr. Ambassador, what is your opinion about the state that neglecting education and health aspect? Is there any more important thing than education and health aspect? Thank you very much.
Okay, test. Okay, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Good afternoon, my distinguished friends. I'm from Republic of Indonesian Defense University, majoring in defense diplomacy. I want to ask something that you are mentioned before, Mr. Ambassador. The first one is about export resources, and the second one is about climate change. I want to merge that two. As we know that Indonesia has started carbon trade in 2023 on September. So I want to ask from our side that we are from defense. I hope this thing is not so sensitive, but as we know that Germany and Indonesia has started the carbon trade. And what do you think about the reinforcement of defense diplomacy through Indonesia and Germany in strengthening national reliance in facing the threat of climate change? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. From the outset, and I'm really sorry to disappoint you, as an ambassador, I can speak about matters that pertain to EU and EU-Indonesia relations. I cannot talk about the government domestic policy choices. That is would be interference, and I have the utmost respect, as I said, for Indonesian democracy, and I believe that internal policy choices have to be discussed by the Indonesians for the Indonesians, but not by foreigners. So I will refrain from that. But on the other topics, there's a strong EU component, so I can discuss about the EU position. So let's start with the electric vehicle and the nickel. And this is also linked to the downstreaming decision and what happened after. So, when Indonesia joined the WTO, when you join the WTO, what do you get from the WTO? What do you get from joining the WTO? Do you know what you get when you join the WTO? Sorry? You get the most favored nation. You get the most, I mean, you get a lot of things, but you get the most favored nation. So that means that if there's no free trade agreement, you get the same tariff duty from another country that country applies to other countries without FTA. This is very important for Indonesia for a simple reason. In terms of pure aggregate tariffs, Indonesia is quite high. It's in the second half of the countries. So Indonesian economy is quite protected through high tariffs. The justification or the rationale is that Indonesia's economy is not at a level that can sustain a lot of vulnerability from totally open trade. But Indonesia has a pretty good deal when WTO rules are respected. So, most favored nation, basically lower tariffs when you export to others. In exchange to that, in exchange to get the MFN, the people commit to trade. What is the commitment to trade? Is the commitment that everyone can buy the Indonesian product. So when there's a ban on export, it is against the WTO rules, because the WTO rules is a give and take. You get the MFN, but you don't do ban of exports, because the principle of trade is that you import and you export. Now, the EU fully respects the economic sovereignty of Indonesia. So what I'm talking about is this is not an official line, but what we want is to discuss with Indonesia what can we import and export with Indonesia. If Indonesia says you cannot use our nickel ores because we need to make more industry at home, this is a good basis. We understand it and we want to discuss. What is very difficult is if for our companies we don't know if the ban applies to the nickel ores, or then after the ores you put it in a sulfate, so a solution, and then from a sulfate you put it in a catalyst, from a catalyst you put it in a battery, from a battery you put it in a car. If we cannot, buy the battery because you have to buy the whole car, then we are not so interested in trading with Indonesia, because we have also a large car industry and we are investing here. BMW, Mercedes are made in Indonesia. So we are interested in trade. But if we cannot have any freedom in how we gonna trade, it's difficult. Why am I saying all that? Because we are in the middle of negotiations, EU and Indonesia, to see how legal certainty we could get to make sure that our car companies and our chemical companies come here to invest in the nickel. So at the moment, the nickel industry, so the nickel ores are operated by Indonesian companies. So they extract the nickel from the mine. And then the Chinese have now developed a very, very competitive edge in smelters. So they are the best in the world to build a smelter. So a smelter takes a lot of coal, put this at very high temperature, and then smelt the nickel. And it smelt the nickel through either an acid or a high temperature thing. And then they transform that into a sulfate. So what we want to know from Indonesia is that if our chemical companies come here, that they can buy the sulfate, put it in a battery, and then export it to Europe for the car industry. And that's how we make business. We buy a product that is made in Indonesia, so there is downstreaming here. But we need to know how far the downstreaming. If we put all the investments here, and then the decision is, oh, now you cannot export the catalyst, or you cannot export the battery, the people will have invested, it's not $1 million. The kind of investment is in the billion, So to answer the first and the third question, what we want is to have legal certainty. And without the legal certainty, or chemical companies or extracting companies will have difficulties to invest more in Indonesia. So that is the whole name of the game. How to make sure we have legal certainty so that we can invest in nickel. Because now, at the moment, all the smelters are Chinese, but also all the companies buying the results are Chinese. And it's very important, I think, with what is coming, that also European companies can buy. Because if China is already overcapacity in China, and they're going to dump the prices of their cars, those cars will not be bought in Europe. So it's very important to diversify the market, but for that we need legal certainty. Now, how can we challenge the AI monopoly of US and China? I think, and that's why I explained the regulation, there's going to be more and more discussion on how you regulate artificial intelligence. And even more than that, all the social platforms. How come all the money of advertising on Instagram is going to just one company? How come you are all paying by going onto these platforms? You are all making just some American companies rich and nobody else. So I think that there's going to be more and more debate about how to regulate artificial intelligence and the productivity, and I think that each country will want to have more control. But at the same time, you want to use the possibility of doing all these interconnections. And that's why I think that the experience of Europe is very important, because we have 27 member states putting things in together, but also putting barriers when health or hate or these kind of things. So I think that there, together we can have respective rules. It's not that EU rules should apply to Indonesia or Indonesian rules should apply to the EU, but we can compare notes on how to preserve economic autonomy, productivity, and integrity. Carbon trading, defense, two very important topic. So which ones are the biggest armament producer in the world? The big ones. You have US, it's the biggest. You have China, you have Russia, a bit Japan, Korea, and then you have lots of Europeans. In Europe, we have a long industry of armament. Now it's for Indonesia to make its choices, but obviously you don't want to buy weapons from the people who could invade you at some stage, because they can always reprogram your weapons or they know how to use them. I just saying. And some countries are very allied with each other, so they wouldn't have secrets to each other. So that restricts a bit the number of suppliers you can look at. From a European point of view, but it's more for the member states, we are very, very happy that and very honored that Indonesia has bought more and more weapons from Europe. And linked to climate change, because we have such strict rules on emissions, when the weapons are manufactured in Europe, they consume far less carbon and cause less emissions. So it's not that weapons are good, I'm not saying that, but if we are entering a more dangerous world, the EU producers are more reliable, more equidistant. Nobody's going to invade you from Europe. And they are also very aware of the environmental footprint. Thank you.
Let's give a big hand for Ambassador Dennis. Unfortunately, ambassadors, we are out of time. But, okay. Allow me to give a... Okay, test. There you go. Dimatiin aja. Okay. Okay, allow me to use this a few minutes to give a closing note. Definitely, on behalf of FPCI, let's give a big hand for Ambassador Dennis for giving a very good, comprehensive, and good pointers, even for you to use it for your papers, right? I see some of you record when Ambassador Dennis talking about the nickel ore and also the EV, right? Good points, and you can use it for your reference. On the Indonesia-EU relationship, and or even ASEAN-EU relationship, I want to share with you a good FPCI insights on it, Ambassador. We done a report called ASEAN People's Perception Survey, and we survey around 2,000 Southeast Asian about the dialogue partners, and EU is one of it. We ask a lot of questions, but we have resort to two questions that tells European in the perceptions of Southeast Asian. So, I start with what is the most concerns issues of Southeast Asia in the next 2 years, okay? The most concern. If I ask you what would happen in the next 2 years, all Southeast Asian answers two things. Number one, most of Southeast Asian, based on our survey, believe climate change induced disaster would happen in Southeast Asia. Okay. Number two is economic crisis because of tariff, because of everything. Okay. Guess what? US, China, all the geopolitics associated conflicts are number 4, number 5, 6, 7. So the concern of Southeast Asian is really a tangible concern about climate change and also about the economic crisis. And then I asked the questions about which dialogue partner you trusted most among the 9, right? Number 1 is Japan, okay? And number 2 is European Union among the 9. Guess where is the US? Number 8, way behind. So it shows that among the Western world or the global north, Southeast Asia has a very comfortable relationship and good feeling with the European. By the way, FVCA never satisfied, only asking, do you trust? We asked the second questions. Which dialogue partners would be the most relevant for the future of ASEAN? The future of ASEAN. Okay, guess. Number 1. Okay, number 1 is Japan, right? Sorry, the future of ASEAN, number 1 is ASEAN. Number 1 is China. Number 1 is China. Number 2 is Japan. Number 3 is European Union. So EU, in the mind of Southeast Asian, anyone watch F1 here? Ambassador, do you watch F1? So EU is just like Ferrari competing with, you know, it's just like Ferrari competing with Mercedes and also with the Red Bulls. Always top 3 in all issues, right? And whereas the US is like the Williams. I don't know. Williams used to be number 1, number 2, but somehow now it's left behind. This is not about comparing between the EU or even the US or even choosing between the two. No, but this is simply telling that Southeast Asian, we have a good, comfortable relationship with the EU, and if you are becoming more comfortable, becoming good friend, of course you will find a lot of difficulties. Of course you will find a lot of differences. Of course you will find, you know, obstacles. And remember, EU and Indonesia and Southeast Asia is far, you know, right? It's far. But the feeling is close. The cultural ties is close. The norms shared is close. And guess what? If people studies about regionalism, people looks to European and look to Southeast Asia. ASEAN, as people here in ASEAN, I love ASEAN. We feel that we are the second, I don't know, we feel that we are the second best after European Union on regionalism. So thank you so much for coming. And again, thank you, Ambassador, for giving your time. Once again, let's give a big hand for Ambassador Dennis and to you. I give it to Mehdi. Thank you.
What a wonderful Q&A session. I myself enjoyed it. Now, thank you, Ambassador, for providing such an insightful lecture for today. And thank you, Kakalfin, for moderating excellently. And I want to thank all of you for your questions. We're now moving on to the group photo session. So we would like to go for, yes. Oh, would you, lasting remark? Okay.
Just 2 words of thanks. Your questions were really, really good. So I hope you can go to study in the EU, because I think the way you ask questions will be beneficial to all the EU. And the second thing is all this presentation was prepared by Mr. Stéphane Mekati. He's the Deputy Chief of Mission. So he prepared the presentation with Tio Silalahai, who is over there. So they did all the work. So I'd like to also thank them very much. Stéphane.
And if you guys also want to take it, we have a table reserved for the catalogs. So don't forget on your way out, okay? Now we're going to do for the first photo session for Kakalfin and Ambassador. Now, will you please stand up? And as for, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, here, yes. Wonderful. Now we're going to the. Oh, okay, one more time. Now we're moving on to the second session. Would you please, Ambassador and Kakalfin, go to the middle of this part? So we're going to take a photo with every FPCA chapter here. So would you please stand up and everyone, yeah, stand up and try to crowd over in the back. Yes. Yeah, in the front. Okay, I think better for every FPCA chapter, please go to the tribune at the back so that the ambassador can go to the, yes. Yes. Maybe first, okay, do the session first. This is very Gen Z. We love an ambassador who's with the times. Yes, every FPCA chapter, go to the tribune, everyone, so that the ambassador Kakalfin can be in the middle. All right, be careful in the back and watch your heads. If it hits the lamp, well, walk it off. Would you like to join the photo session? No. Okay. Oops. Okay, in the back, please be careful. Okay. Okay, wait, on the, okay, left side, please be careful. Okay, all right. All right, take your poses. Thank you so much, everyone. Okay, everyone, this is the end of our EU Ambassador Lecture. First, I would like to thank you for everyone who attended here, both present and online. And please share us your moments through our social media. And don't forget to also get through the catalogs here at the table. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for today. We absolutely loved having you here.